All right, good morning or good day or good evening. You could be watching this at midnight, I suppose. I'm Professor St. Clair. I'm sorry that this is going up so late, but a lot of things that I thought were going to work a certain way were not working a certain way. So I'll get better as it goes along, okay? This is for the History 117 class, World History 2 from 1500. We're going to be dealing with Chapter 19. And the way I think this will work is you do the reading in the textbook so that you get the details of things. And then either one or two lectures a week, I'll try to fill that out. Okay, expand on some of that a little bit. I'm going to try to keep these bits to a half an hour or so. I've got a big clock sitting up on top. You can't see it, but because I know I'm not the most exciting speaker, and it's even worse when I'm sitting here in my apartment and not in front of you, making hand gestures and stuff. So I'll try to be cognizant of all of our attention spans, etc. Okay. So world history is basically the history of the world. It's 500 years. It's the whole world. And basically the last 500 years are the story of Europeans coming to dominance in the world. Starting with the voyages that are talked about in this chapter of Vasco da Gama, Columbus, they mentioned Magellan, a little later on, Captain Cook, a British sailor. And so by 1900, you have a world where almost every part of the world is controlled either as a colony of Europe, most of Africa, large parts of Asia, or is a former colony of Europeans, as in the United States or South America, those countries. And then, of course, part of the story of the 20th century is decolonialization, people breaking away from their colonial masters. Now, one thing you have to sort of concern yourself with when you're studying world history is what we call Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism, Eurocentrism, Eurocentrism. It's the idea that somehow Europeans are unique and special, and their civilization is better, and they've invented the three-piece suit, and Christianity is the true religion, other religions are false religions. Just a whole complex of ideas that put Europeans at the top of a sort of imaginary civilization hierarchy. And although these days nobody really comes out and says that, they manage to get that idea across in certain ways. Now this chapter is transoceanic encounters and global connections, and it's about the Europeans going out on these voyages. We've all gotten some knowledge of them. But let me show you something here. There's a map on 354, 355 that shows basically the voyages of Bartolomeo Diaz, Christopher Columbus, and Vasco da Gama. Okay? Now that's all factual. Those voyages were made by those people at that time. But what it doesn't show is that in this part of the world over here, the Indian Ocean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of merchants sailing ships from from China to India, India to East Africa, up to the Muslim world there in the Middle East, up the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. This is the center of world trade, and it's kind of left out. And I guess that's okay if you're only interested in Europeans. But it also sort of sets you up to think, well, the Europeans were the only people that got out on the ocean, and that is just untrue. And to sort of drive home the point a little bit, there's this map on 358. Shows the voyages of Ferdinand Magellan and 3 different voyages of James Cook, Captain James Cook. Okay? It's true that Europeans were crossing the Pacific. It doesn't really show the Atlantic. Oh, it does show the Atlantic on one end there, over here. But again, the Indian Ocean is just Europeans. And if you weren't Catholic, you would think to yourself, oh, only Europeans got out there. Now, the textbook I used to use, went Europe, and then the Muslim world, and then the Far East, China and Japan. This goes a little bit different, but that's okay. But just keep that in mind. But there is an event in China that I sort of didn't mark it, but I will now. Let's see. So that's 350, that chapter, and this is now chapter 23, page 433. Okay. They mention very briefly the voyages of under the Emperor Yongle in China. Perhaps you've heard the name Zheng He, but perhaps not. But here's all it says about it. The Emperor Yongle reigned from 1403 to 1424, and he launched a series of naval expeditions that went as far as Malindi in East Africa. Yongle's successors discontinued the expeditions, but maintained the centralized state that Hongwu had established. Okay, so that's all we get about those voyages. And I have this other book. I tried using it as an earlier edition as a textbook, and it kind of didn't work. It was too weird. He's trying to write a non-Eurocentric history of the world, modern world. Okay, it's the Origins of the Modern World by Robert B. Marks. I don't know. I looked for a PDF because it would be helpful sometimes to read some of this stuff. But I couldn't find one that didn't require you to sign up and stuff like that. I don't like signing up. But I will borrow some stuff from here. See, he has this a map of the trading worlds. I don't know if you can see this, but it's much more complicated than just Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeo Diaz. There's a lot going on in the Indian Ocean world. Now I wanted to find a. Here it is. This is a section called "The Voyages of Zheng He," from 1405 to 1433. Right? This is 60 years before Columbus. Probably more than that. 1405 would be 80-something years before Columbus. Well, I'm just going to read a little bit because I want you to think about this. Anybody know how many ships Columbus had? Or how many men he had in the crew of those 3 ships? I just gave the answer. The names of the ships is probably what you remember, but that's not the important part. And how big the ships were. Okay, they were 3 relatively small ships. They were highly maneuverable, and they were good ships, but they were small. Okay, and he had to struggle to get Isabella and Ferdinand sort of finance that trip. Okay, and compared to the Chinese emperor, all of the monarchs in Europe were kind of poor, you know. In Europe, they seemed very, very wealthy, but compared to the Chinese emperor, they were not that wealthy. He says, in the autumn of 1405, the largest fleet of ships the world had ever seen, or would see for another 500 years, began assembling in the mouth of the Yangtze River on China's eastern coast. Over 300 ships, manned by 27,000 sailors, waited for the winter monsoon winds to take them down toward Indonesia and then west through the Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean. They had set Calicut, a major trading city on India's west coast, as their destination. Columbus, 3 ships. I think about 86 men. And this is 300 ships and 27,000 men. Right? They were under the command of Admiral Zheng He. He talks about their objectives, which I'm going to skip. It says, to prepare for these voyages, China had undergone a frenzy of shipbuilding between 1404 and 1407. Some 1,681 ships were built. The largest ships were the 9-masted treasure ships of Admiral Zheng He. They were about 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. I believe you could have put all 3 of Columbus's ships on one of these treasure ships. And then he says it's longer than an American football field, which I always wonder, when did an American football field become a unit of measure? Okay. Other ships of the fleet, ranging in size and function, carried horses, goods for trade, supplies, water tankers, and marines. That would be soldiers, right? Seagoing soldiers. Some were warships bristling with cannons and rockets. He says so much wood was required to construct the fleet that much of China's southeast coast was deforested. There was no forest left. And timbers had to be floated 1,000 miles down the Yangtze River to the shipyards. Okay. He then goes on to talk about their adventures. They go as far as East Africa. I suppose I could get the map out and show you how far that is. He's got a map here, but it's split in the middle. But they're going from China to East Africa over here. I don't know if you can see that. China to East Africa. They bring back ostriches, zebras, giraffes. The really odd animals, you know, these sort of interesting, strange animals with long necks or stripes or giant birds. They have there's a voyage where they connect up with the Muslim world. They dock, or they come ashore at Jeddah, which is a few days' journey from Mecca, and they establish connections with many of these Muslim kingdoms, nations, whatever. All right. Let's see. there's a little bit about Chinese Muslims, which is interesting. And then in the 1430s, a different group comes to power in the capital, and decides to stop the voyages. Okay, so the points I want to make are there's a few points. One is that the Chinese emperor could both start and stop these voyages, and that they were on a scale that was much, much larger than European voyages would be until, maybe the middle of the 17th century. So in the early 15th century, the Chinese are doing things that Europeans won't be able to do until the middle of the 17th century. 1620, Plymouth gets founded here in the United States, in Massachusetts. And then, I think like a decade or two later, there's a real, like a fleet of 1,000 ships, or several hundred ships, comes bringing more pilgrims to Massachusetts. That's the middle of the 17th century. The other thing is that the Chinese don't do the kind of thing that Columbus does. The stories I've always read about Columbus, he gets off the ship, he kneels down, he says a prayer of thanksgiving to God, which may or may not be true, I don't know. It does portray Columbus as a God-fearing, good Catholic. And then he claims the land for Isabel and Ferdinand, the whole Western Hemisphere, basically. The Chinese don't do that. They're not looking to conquer people. They just want to set up relations with these other societies, which is a very different thing. It also sort of indicates that although Europe is coming out of the doldrums, and is more and more sophisticated, the Chinese have been sophisticated for a very, very long time and are capable of doing a lot of stuff that Europeans won't be able to do for a while, right? So I think those are the 2 points. The resources available to the emperor, and the fact that the Chinese don't believe that you conquer people when you go out and meet them in these endeavors. Okay. Now let's. I have a few more minutes if I'm going to keep it under a half an hour or so. It says 18 minutes 13 seconds here. So I do want to talk about Europe's situation at the time of Columbus, say. Or maybe a few centuries before. Go back to like the 11th century or something like that. We generally think of technology as iPhones, stealth bombers, Priuses, I don't know, that kind of stuff. But they're important and simple technologies that Europe doesn't come up with on their own. And the first one, and I sometimes think it's the most important one, is the number system. Until like 1208, when a mathematician named Fibonacci publishes a book, I can't remember the title, Abaci Arabia, something like that. It shows how to use what we call Arabic numerals to calculate things. Now, Arabic numerals are those are the numerals we use today. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. Until that point, the early 1200s, all you had were Roman numerals. And you really can't do anything but count with Roman numerals. There's no way to do long division or multiplication even. You know, it's just, it doesn't really work. And for years I thought that they must have had Arabic numerals much sooner than 1200, but that, I looked into it and that's it, okay? Now this becomes very important because one of the things that gives Europeans an advantage is capitalism. You know, building up businesses where profit is the main motive, and part of that is strict accounting, bookkeeping, and that's also something they get from others. And you can't do that with Roman numerals. You just can't do that. You can count popes and kings. Sometimes clocks have Roman numerals. Musicians use them for chords as opposed to notes. But you can't really do bookkeeping with Roman numerals. Anyway, so that's one thing. Where did they get them from? Well, the name gives you a clue. Arabic numerals, they got them from Arabs or Muslims. The Muslims, though, and the Arabs had gotten them from India. India is where that number system really originates, right? But it's outside of Europe. Now, another important thing is paper, which I don't, you know, it's so ubiquitous in our world, we don't think of it as a technology, but it absolutely is. And the Chinese have invented paper centuries ago. And at some point, Muslim armies were up in the north of China, and they captured some Chinese soldiers who knew how to make paper. They brought them back to Baghdad and set up the first paper mill in that part of the world. And then when the Crusades came along, Europeans, it passed on, the knowledge of paper and how to make it passed on to Europeans. Right? Now, before that, people were using papyrus or lambskins, vellum, parchment to write. And it was kind of you couldn't get it as thin as paper, and it was a problem. And paper is important. I mean, has anybody been to CVS lately? You have to get a 4-yard long receipt. Paper is pretty important. Paper money, writing, books, literacy, the printing press. None of that happens without paper. You can't really work the printing press on parchment. It's just not going to work. And if you don't have if somebody doesn't invent the printing press, which they wouldn't do if they didn't have paper, then you don't get the rising levels of literacy. More and more people able to read, able to buy books because they're now cheaper, and sort of get on the road that way. One of the strange things about Europe is that until at least the year 1000, and maybe later, almost everybody in Europe is illiterate. They do not read. There isn't a class of scholars, and the clergy does some reading, but even the guys that are copying books don't know how to read, so they're kind of guessing at what they're doing. Right? And then, so paper comes from the Chinese through the Arab world. Numbers come from India through the Arab world. Gunpowder comes from the Chinese through the Mongols into Europe. And gunpowder, that's a big advantage the Europeans have in the struggle for dominance in the world. Okay? Cannons, muskets, guns. And it's true that gunpowder, when it comes to Europe, very quickly develops. It develops very rapidly. The use of cannons and muskets and guns and stuff like that. Not because the Europeans are particularly ingenious, but because they're fighting all the time. They need better guns, better cannon, better. China is one unified structure with one emperor, and Europe is a whole, quilt, a patchwork quilt of countries fighting with each other all the time. Name a number and there's a war, a 9 years war, an 11 years war, 30 years war, 100 years war. The Europeans never stop fighting. So you introduce a new weapon system into that boiling pot, and things are going to develop very rapidly. Okay, and that's what happens. And then the fourth thing, there's a fourth thing, and this is probably what gives rise to the Renaissance. Okay? In Europe, in libraries, in monasteries, and places like that, there were all sorts of manuscripts written in the Greek language. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, whoever, Archimedes, the playwrights, all that kind of stuff. And nobody knew how to read them. Nobody knew Greek. And I mean, there were a few people that read even Latin, but nobody knew how to read Greek. And during the Crusades, which I probably won't mention much more than this, the Europeans come in contact with the Islamic world. And the Islamic world had for a very long time been in contact or had in their societies the descendants of Greeks who had been run out of Europe. There were all these Greek pagans. They call them pagans, but they're really students of Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle and Plato have schools in Greece that are closed down in the 4th century, I believe. And people are just chased out, and they go to Persia or they go to other parts of the East, and then those countries get converted to Islam. And in its early centuries, Muslims were very interested in learning. They learned Greek. They learned to read and write it and speak it even, I suppose. And during the Crusades, that begins to be passed on to the Europeans. And it's a very important change in the way people think. Right? Catholicism is basically you're a sinner, and you'll always be a sinner. And even when you do good things, it's because your ego is involved, and it's still a sin. I don't know anybody else. I don't know how you guys were brought up religiously, but this was sort of Catholic school stuff. Perhaps it's not applicable to all of you. But the Greeks had a very different idea. They thought humans were the top of creation, and were capable of perfection almost, and stuff like that. So just that little difference in thinking is what sparks the Renaissance. People start questioning a little bit, the monolithic thought processes of the church. Right? Well, that's about it. I think that's enough. You get your facts from the textbook. You want to know about James Cook? It's all laid out in there. What happens is Europeans go around the world. They're mostly motivated by profit, although there are attempts to convert people and set up missions and that kind of thing. And it isn't too long into this. Columbus is 1492. I think the first Africans are brought to the New World in 1502, so it's 10 years, and you start to get slavery. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Africa. But that's an important aspect of the story. But they set up trading posts in different places where where the native populations are decimated by diseases that the Europeans bring. Those areas they're able to take over and sort of make colonies out of them. South America, North America, the Caribbean. Other areas where the population is not susceptible to the disease, Europeans cannot really conquer those areas. So they set up trading posts, or they set up another kind of system so that they can exploit those areas for profit. All right, have a good weekend, and I'll see you, or I won't see you, next week sometime. All right? Thank you very much. See if we can turn it off without getting the thumb too much in the picture. No, it's not possible.